Thank you very much, Chairman. My topic is echoes of the Bandung movement in the Caribbean and China's presence in the region today. And I choose the word echoes because the Caribbean certainly was not in Bandung in 1955, but the echoes and the repercussions of Bandung had an impact on the Caribbean. I'm glad for the opportunity of participating in this meeting, as without it, I would not have remembered the Bandung Conference. The statement accompanying the draft program poses very important questions about how we think about the present and notes that, quote, ex-socialist, ex-colonized, and ex-third world countries seem to have emerged as the leading edge of global capitalism, unquote. We therefore need to critically reflect on, quote, on the histories, the trajectories, and the conditions of the world being transformed. The statement further poses a question: are these rising economies with a revolutionary and anti-imperialist past able to break the conquering and exploitative logics of capitalism, or simply to reproduce what they were fighting against? I think some of the issues posed in this question, in the statement introducing this conference, some of the issues inherent in this question were being discussed in the last panel. These questions are being posed in the context of the post-Cold War world, the fall of Eastern European communism, and the global systemic reach of neoliberal ideas. And this context means that there is no clear line between the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the 60th anniversary in 2015. And again, much of the discussion we have had today indicates this fact. If we examine the goals of Bandung, the historical evidence suggests that the scale of the economic relations between China and Africa and China and Latin America provide policy options and opportunities which were unthinkable in the last half of the 20th century. In thinking about past solidarities, we have to be hard-headed about present-day possibilities and how new solidarities can be shaped. The broad goals of Bandung and the 29 Asian and African countries that met in Indonesia in 1955 were as follows, and I quote some of these objectives. First of all, to promote goodwill and cooperation among the nations of Africa and Asia, to explore and advance their mutual as well as common interests, and to establish and further friendliness and neighborly relations. Secondly, to consider social, economic, and cultural problems and relations of the countries represented. Thirdly, to consider problems of special interest to Asian and African peoples, for example, problems affecting national sovereignty and of racialism and colonialism. Finally, to view the position of Asia and Africa and their peoples in the world of today and the contribution they can make to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. And these quotations are taken from the volume by Richard Wright. These are sufficiently broad perspectives that can still serve as valid guidelines to solidarity in the 21st century. I turn to the Bandung movement and the echoes in the English-speaking Caribbean. Let me selectively identify some markers of the Bandung movement in the English-speaking Caribbean. Asia is a far cry from the Caribbean geographically. However, given the presence of Indians and Chinese in the region since the 19th century, the Asian presence is part of our cultural and economic and political landscape. The Caribbean is a crossroads of global cultures of Africa, Asia, Europe, as well as the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The political echoes of Bandung and the Caribbean were heard in the mass mobilization of Eric Williams, the Trinidadian intellectual and politician, in 1956, at the time when he organized the People's National Movement and led Trinidad to independence in 1962. He served as Prime Minister until his death in 1981. Bandung therefore served as a banner of political solidarity against colonialism, which was a system of white supremacy and economic domination of peoples of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. But for Eric Williams, it was also a metaphor for the unity between the descendants of enslaved Africans and indentured Indian labor, and how they could live in one nation as nationals and not as colonial subjects. There are few witnesses to the events that took place in Indonesia 60 years ago. However, there are still many who can recall the echoes of Bandung in Caribbean politics in the 1970s and early 1980s. Echoes of Bandung were to be heard in the 1970s, when radical currents and social movements developed out of Rastafari, Black Power, civil rights protests, and the programs of social democratic political parties. It was the decade when 4 Caribbean nations, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and Barbados, recognized and developed diplomatic relations with Cuba in opposition to the United States. It was also the decade when Guyana and Jamaica established diplomatic relations with China in 1972, and other Caribbean territories followed suit later on. The thinking at the time was geared towards the development of a multipolar world that would transcend the bipolar universe that characterized the Cold War, and where newly independent states were coerced into choosing between the United States and the Soviet Union. Rejection of this bipolar choice led many ex-colonial countries in the direction of the non-aligned movement and the right to choose one's friends. Another current that developed was the movement for the new international economic order. Echoes of Bandung were to be heard in the speeches of Michael Manley, Prime Minister of Jamaica, 1972-1980, and 1989-1992. These echoes were also heard in the broadcast journalism of Peter Abrahams, the South African Jamaican journalist and novelist, for much of the last half of the 20th century. In Manley's speeches and in Peter Abrahams' broadcasts, the hope that the non-aligned movement would come into its own economically through self-reliance was frequently expressed. The idea of non-alignment is now outdated, and self-reliance, as well as conceptions of self-reliance, were abandoned by China as an economic route and replaced instead by pragmatic economic policies. However, I think in superficial rejection of self-reliance and non-alignment, one has to refer to the content of what this means in terms of being able to engage with the international system from the standpoint of one's own interests. These are matters for urgent discussion, as there is no straight line, as I said, between Bandung 1955 and our present conjuncture. What lies in between Bandung and now has not been adequately examined from the standpoint of those countries which were signatories to the Bandung Declaration. We are now in the process of the beginning of substantial shifts in global power relations. We are also witnesses to a new international economic order in the making, evidenced by the emergence of China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and other states whose economic growths have been impressive. The economic growth of China has led to the global spread of its investments and influence and the emergence of an infrastructure bank. The echoes of Bandung in the Caribbean are therefore faint today and can be revived, however, they can be revived in the coming years, but that depends on political leadership that can interpret the new global realities, which in my view are now more propitious to the ideas of Bandung, at least on the economic front. This requires an orientation that strengthens regionalism among the Caribbean's small states and the discouragement of tendencies towards parochialism and short-term frames of reference. This is necessary to combat the region's political fragmentation with its micronationalisms predominating over the efforts to develop a relevant 21st century regional voice. The English-speaking Caribbean states are a micro-region in the wider Americas, where you have a population of 800 million people of Spanish and Portuguese speakers. The English-speaking Caribbean has a combined population of just over 6 million people, with the smallest territory, St. Kitts and Nevis, having 50,000, and the largest, Jamaica, 2.7 million, according to 2010 figures. The preoccupation of the people of this region is with two issues, and I'll just, in the interest of time, mention these without reading the text. One is the economic question and high levels of indebtedness. Jamaica has an indebtedness of 140% of its gross domestic product. And the second challenge concerns high levels of homicide, with at least 3 Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Belize, and St. Kitts and Nevis, are in the top 10 countries with high homicide rates. Given these challenges, it is not surprising that there is much interest in the region in developing economic relations with China by governments and business sector, and a great deal of interest among the popular masses. I turn now to Caribbean-China relations. Indicative of this interest in China was the publication in 2014 entitled "The Dragon in the Caribbean: China's Global Redimensioning Challenges and Opportunities for the Caribbean," written by economist Richard Burnell. This text encourages Caribbean governments and businesses to take advantage of the investment opportunities being open for trade with China. Opportunities arising from Chinese investments are uppermost in the thinking of Caribbean states, with some aligning themselves with Taiwan for reasons of money and others with China. Jamaica and Guyana, as I pointed out, have had diplomatic relations with China since 1972. And the People's National Party, the ruling party in Jamaica, has good party-to-party relations with the Communist Party of China. In Guyana, party-to-party relations were initiated by Forbes Burnham when he was Prime Minister of Guyana, President of Guyana. Trinidad and Tobago has had relations with China since 1974. Other countries that have recognized China are Barbados 1977, Antigua 1983, Bahamas 1997. Dominica has had relations with China since 2004. Belize had relations with China in 1987 to 89 and shifted to Taiwan since 1989. Grenada has moved between China and Taiwan in 1985-89. It recognized China and shifted to Taiwan between 1989 to 2005. Since 2005, Grenada has established relations with China. St. Lucia had diplomatic relations with Taiwan from 1984 to 1997, and with China from 1997 to 2007, and is now back with Taiwan. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has had diplomatic relations with Taiwan since 1981. So to conclude on this diplomatic hop, skip, and jump, there is competition between these two Asian states for diplomatic relations with the microstates of the Caribbean. And in some cases, decisions on these matters are made on the basis of money and not on any political principle. So the Anglophone Caribbean microstates have no common policy with regard to relations with China, although a majority of them have relations with China. I turn now to the existential situation of African people and Chinese in Jamaica. Allow me to comment very briefly on this existential situation. Historically, Chinese migration followed the roots of the British Empire from South China, where Hakka-speaking Han Chinese migrated from the middle of the 19th century to find work in agriculture and infrastructural projects such as the Panama Canal. These Chinese migrants opened shops and over time became an economic force in the retail trade. In the economic and political crisis of the 1970s in Jamaica, many of them migrated and prospered in Canada, with 2 Jamaican Chinese becoming billionaires in that country. Those Chinese who remained made investments to enhance their retail operations with modern supermarkets. The creolized Chinese have been joined by a new generation of Chinese migrants who have gone into retail business in working class areas in several towns in Jamaica. Mainland Chinese politics has always impacted the Chinese community in Jamaica. I grew up hearing of battles between the Kuomintang and the communists in Chinatown in Kingston. After 1989, when there were student demonstrations in China, I attended a meeting of the Chinese community in Kingston, which was open to the public, and the audience was divided between those who supported the Chinese government and those who were on the side of the students. Today, there is an active discussion about Chinese investments in the region by all sectors of society. However, no one frames this discussion historically with respect to the Bandung tradition. It is therefore timely to have the Bandung framework resurrected at this meeting. If the Bandung framework is not resurrected, then the relations between the Chinese state and the Caribbean people will be seen more in the light of economic exploitation than anything else. Pan-African-minded Jamaicans watch with interest the influence of China in Africa, about which my colleague will speak. Many were pleased with the new African Union building in Addis Ababa constructed by the Chinese. However, as a reader of Howard French's journalistic book, whatever his criticisms, that book China's second, whatever the criticism may be made of it, the book Chinese Second Continent, How Million Immigrants Are Building a New Empire in Africa, I was dismayed by the racial stereotypes that Chinese investors and business people brought to bear on Africa. Our Chinese investors who express racial stereotypes of African people breathing a new life into old forms of racial oppression. Professor Said Adejumobi notes in a recent article, in sum, China is now Africa's biggest trading partner, with a trade volume of over $200 billion annually, leaving the United States and Europe in a distant second and third, respectively. The massive trading relationship between China and Africa is not a coincidence. It is something actively promoted by African governments and also encouraged by China's new market orientation policy. However, the relationship does not stop at economics and trade. There's also a growing social dynamic. Hitherto uncommon intermarriages or conjugation are occurring, with a new breed of African Chinese or Chinese Africans being born, creating unprecedented identities and social spaces, unquote. The latter social dynamic and sexual relations have been part of Caribbean nation formation since the 19th century. Chinese people are less than 1% of the Jamaican population, which is over 90% of people with an African heritage. But there's a much larger percentage of the population which claim both African and Chinese heritage. There is therefore a racial dimension to Sino-Jamaican relations. Jamaican Chinese are integrated into Jamaican society, but are regarded as a relatively privileged sector, although there are poor Chinese to be seen, but not in large numbers. Chinese musicians and producers have been central to the development of Jamaican popular music, particularly the reggae music. And Trinidadian Chinese are heavily involved in the famous carnival and cultural life of that country. And the same can be said of for Suriname and other territories in the region with a Chinese presence. Chinese have also been active in the political life in the region. I now turn to my concluding section on 21st century solidarity. At the Bandung Conference, the focus was on building Asian-African solidarity, asserting political sovereignty and non-interference from the big powers, overturning colonial rule and preventing neocolonialism in the early years of the Cold War. The African-American writer Richard Wright, who was excited by the prospects of this conference, represented the majority of the world's peoples, wrote a book entitled The Color Curtain, a report on the Bandung Conference. The Color Curtain referred to global racial discrimination, the emergence into the international arena of the brown and black peoples of Asia and Africa was heralded by Richard Wright and many others as an opportunity to undermine racism through the achievement of sovereignty from Europe. Few would argue with the fact that the Iron Curtain is coming down with the latest rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. After more than 50 years, this rapprochement signals engagement between these two neighbors with a view to resuming bilateral relations. Removing the color curtain remains a persistent and difficult challenge which needs to be addressed. The Declaration of the United Nations at the next decade, 2015 to 2024, is to be marked as the International Decade for People of African Descent is significant. The Declaration notes, and I quote, "People of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and respected. Around 200 million people identifying themselves as being of African descent live in the Americas. Millions more live in other parts of the world, outside the African continent, in Europe, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and Asia. Any discussion of the legacy of Bandung must deal with the persistence of racism on a global level, particularly against dark-skinned people. In conclusion, I hope we can frame a project that may be consistent with the Bandung ideals. Among these are basic aspirations for a better life, with freedom from hunger, unemployment, poverty, as indicated in the last panel, war and violence, racial discrimination, and with respect for each other. A radical shift from the old power balances of the last half a millennium is what is hoped for. This shift should be reflected in the balance of power, a shift in the balance of power within all international institutions. All international institutions need to reflect this shift, therefore, in that balance. The development of new institutions, such as the emergence of the African Infrastructural Bank, is an indication of this trust, but how that will function remains to be seen. While cooperation at the level of the state and political parties is important, civil society interaction and intellectual exchanges that impact on knowledge development and exchange and the development of our human potential, all these need to be encouraged and developed in the spirit of Bandung.